Hello everyone, and welcome back to another video. In this particular video, I'll be discussing the Count of Monte Cristo, who is the Count of Mount Christ. And the particular tale, as depicted by Alexandre Dumas, is the notion behind a man whom is sent by Napoleon to deliver a message. Now, in said man, we find a particular individual known as Edmond Dantes. Dantes essentially represents in that particular story the man that is known as, in history, as Thomas Alexandre Dumas. Thomas Alexandre Dumas is the Count of Monte Cristo, which in this development of tales were not just tales of fiction by Alexandre Dumas depicting the stories which his father would tell him, based on the life that his father lived. In the development of Alexandre Dumas, in his tales, we find other tales, such as The Man in the Iron Mask, The Three Musketeers, Robin des Bois, also known as Robin Hood. And we also see the Count of Monte Cristo. And in this particular depiction, we find the tales of essentially the knowledge that Alexandre Dumas would learn from his father's life. Now, in his father's life, we're not based on fictional tales either, because you see, Thomas Alexandre Dumas was a general, and not just any general. He was the right-hand man of Napoleon. And in this man was where the future of France was to be passed down upon. Already being from the family as the son of a baron, which said baron was a man of heirness to the throne of France. But as a mixed individual, Thomas Alexandre Dumas was born of a slave mother, that which his baron father, upon the purchase of the islands of Haiti, would create a sugar plantation and develop his wealth within said plantation beyond being banished from France in order to not have a rivalry towards the throne of France. And in this rivalry, upon the initial death of said king, this particular baron would then be the new king. But in the development and destroyment of the French monarchy, we then found that Thomas Alexandre Dumas would lead the revolution, that which created the downfall of said monarchy within France at said era. And beyond the development and downfall of said monarchy, a new ruler was meant to take place. But rather than calling them king, they began calling them an emperor. In this particular time, we see a rivalry as well arise. The people were behind the man known as Thomas Alexandre Dumas, because he was the rightful heir as a man of the revolution leading said revolution. The people were in the motion behind this particular man. But then came the rivalry as another battle lord known as Napoleon. Now Napoleon had a gained advantage because meanwhile Thomas Alexandre Dumas was off fighting the battles himself. Napoleon was positioned within Paris to oversee said kingdom. And it came to a point where essentially Napoleon would gain control of where said battles would then ensue. And then began the expansion, such as the battle within Cairo and Egypt, whereupon realizing that Thomas Alexandre Dumas realized himself that this was a death mission that was meant to be his end. Even after escaping and fighting off with the few horses that were dying off, they began to eat said horses in order to survive within the desert. And further moving along, then he tries to make his way back to France in order to deliver a message that which the true king was returning home. But at that particular time, as he was passing by the Italian coastline, Thomas Alexandre Dumas was captured and he was then imprisoned. And while he was imprisoned, he was also tortured and his health deteriorated tremendously. Meanwhile, he was in prison. His wife, whom there is a deep history behind the love he had for his wife, he wouldn't have become this man of great now imprisonment if it wasn't in order to be the man that his wife dreamed of. But she is not the person to blame at this particular point, as some might see a perspective going into that direction. Napoleon was to blame for this particular imprisonment, and even his wife, Thomas Alexandre Dumas' wife, would beg Napoleon. She would beg the officers that which Thomas Alexandre Dumas himself had led into battle, and she would beg them to please release her husband from imprisonment, even if it meant just to live a free life in the countryside. And for years this continued and continued until eventually Thomas Alexandre Dumas broke out of said prison. And after breaking out of said prison, he's then sent on a mission to return to Paris. But by that time, legislation had stripped all officers of the military and other ranking officers and any particular status within said kingdom of people of African or mixed race status. And so then Thomas Alexandre Dumas was stripped entirely of what he was meant to have become, which was to be the King of France, the next in line. And Thomas Alexandre Dumas' life ends in a tragedy. His health deteriorated so much that he was barely even alive for the last bit of his life. And the only thing that remained alive was the stories that which his young son would then learn from his mother. As Thomas Alexandre Dumas died when Alexandre Dumas was only 2 years old. So he himself never grew up with having a paternal figure. In the Dumas lineage now arises the particular heir of the true King of France. Because see, if in this particular king had taken on the throne at said time, being Alexandre Dumas, in the next, beyond Thomas Alexandre Dumas, we would have seen that in said time, if France had not chosen Napoleon as a ruler by being misled and manipulated by an extremely brilliant man such as Napoleon, but also of a deep narcissistical nature, we would have not seen the expansion of the French Empire and its conquering, and we would not have seen the venturing even beyond further governments of France to expand westward into said Canada as an example. This moment defined in French history of not choosing Thomas Alexandre Dumas and the valors he respected and represented then led into a different evolution within said world. And in this particular notion, we would find that there now lies a heir to said throne of France, as the people of France themselves are sick and tired of this Macronist regime. But in understanding this particular concept, why is Thomas Alexandre Dumas the Count of Monte Cristo? And why might his values be represented in such a tale? Because even in having everything when he was born, to then having nothing and having everything taken away from him, he then gained and regained everything the moment he then became a servant once more. In the notion of the Christ, we find that Christ himself is not above, but is a servant, which even as a king, as seen as Christ, he himself is a servant. What might that be? Why might Thomas Alexandre Dumas have been compared to a symbolization of Christ as a altered story, if you wish? A story of great suffering. From this lineage, we then see the development of the lineage of the Gospel of Thomas. The Gospel of Thomas was discovered in a small region a few hundred kilometers just south of Cairo, down the Nile River. Who might have written said Gospel of Thomas. It was discovered in 1945 within a clay pot with other belongings, and it was not recognized once again by said church now for being of a more advanced view or way of thinking regarding Christianity. Who might have written said gospel? I would argue that the coming of Christ within said Thomas, such as other gospels, a coming of Christ within said disciple. But the disciple does not defer the particular individual that followed Christ at said particular time. A disciple of Christ can be a person at any particular era. And from this particular point, you could actively see that a Christ coming within self creates a Messiah-like experience, which through these tales, the same story of suffering manifested in different representations is then represented from one particular archetype. But where does this archetype end? Because if in understanding the downward lineage of things, you would have to see that this archetype is then passed downwards from one lineage. Which then begs the question once again, whom is the heir to the throne of France? In this present day and age, there are many Dumas descendants. And so, in understanding this particular tale, which Dumas descendant would France choose as their rightful king if they were given the chance to specifically return to a monarchy with God at the forefront of belief and faith behind said civilization? Where might we find a beauty in faith? It depends at which rate you find yourself having to uphold your spirit. And in tough times, I invite you to pursue your faith further, as in tough times you might find your faith grows as the light shines brighter. And at the end of the day, it is up to you to let the light shine. So, if France was to once again be illuminated by a member of the clergy, a monarch, would said kingdom choose to have a monarch to rule over all, and said monarch himself a servant just the same? Merci pour m'écouter. Et au peuple français, ce n'est pas une décision de peuple, c'est une décision d'un homme qui contient cette décision. Mais cet homme lui-même n'est pas guidé par son propre esprit, si vous pouvez me comprendre à ce point. Il est guidé par un autre. Et le plus qu'on peut comprendre que l'histoire du royaume, du peuple du monde, est écrite de cette perspective, on pourra comprendre pourquoi la France a été guidée dans l'enfer. Mais en se sortant de cet endroit, on a une possibilité à une rédemption. Pardonnez mon franglais. Ça fait des années que je ne parle plus le français. Est-ce que vous voulez du changement? Ou est-ce que le changement, vous voulez? Merci.